There are lots of emerging fundraising trends out there. And on top of that, there's always new and emerging technologies that we can use to help our organizations raise money. Whether you're an executive director or a fundraiser, a lot of times we're in charge of making these decisions about what to pursue next. How do we grow our fundraising program? How do we continue to leverage what we've done in order to reach bigger and better goals for our nonprofit? So that often means, what should we pursue? Should we try crowdfunding? Should we try fundraising on Facebook? Should we focus on major gifts? I think the decisions can sometimes be truly overwhelming for us to figure out what we should do. And sometimes it just feels like we're throwing spaghetti at the wall, trying to figure out what's going to work for our organization and what's going to be that really amazing opportunity for us to leverage. Well, in today's video, I want to talk about how you can make better decisions around what to pursue in your nonprofit's fundraising strategy and give you some tips for how you can implement this at your organization. My name is Vanessa Chase Lakshan, and I'm the president of the Storytelling Nonprofit, a training and consulting company that works with nonprofit organizations to help them tell stories that raise money and awareness. And one of the ways we do this is through our fundraising consulting work with organizations. I've consulted with many nonprofits over the years in an effort to help them figure out what their next best move is in their fundraising program. And maybe you're in a similar position. My approach to figuring out what the next best move is for a fundraising program does not involve a starting process where I look outside of the organization, where I look externally at trends and emerging strategies. Those things are important. I'll definitely give you that. But what I think it does is really set organizations up to chase trends and shiny objects that ultimately won't serve them in most cases, and really set them up to miss out on an opportunity to pursue potentially more valuable opportunities that already exist within their fundraising program. Instead, what I do is I look at a lot of data and I look to see what story the data is telling me. I really do this because I think it's a steadfast way to figure out what's going to work for your organization. And I think your organization being the operative words in that statement. What works for another organization may not work for yours. What works in terms of industry best practices or benchmarks may not actually be applicable to your organization, because the organizations that are included in those studies and benchmarks and whatnot may not look identical to yours. That's a really important consideration, and one I think we often overlook. So what sort of data do I look at? Well, I look at data that's useful for developing internal benchmarks for an organization. I always emphasize with our clients that it's useful to develop your own benchmarks, because that will help you get a better marker for your own success over time. So I almost always look at donor retention because I think that's a really valuable one to look at. I also look at things like the data for a mid-level giving program. Sometimes I'll look at data for a major gifts program or major donors. We'll also look at things like the amount of money raised per direct mail letter sent, or if it's an email program, the amount of money raised per email sent. These are just a couple of examples of numbers I'll look at, and I'll often look at quite a few more. But usually the numbers I select to look at and the data I look at really depends on what problem I'm trying to solve. And so if I'm looking at an annual giving program, it might be more specific to that. Whereas if it's a major donor or mid-level program, the numbers might be, again, specific to those things. What I think is really important, though, is that looking at the numbers is really just the beginning. However, they do start to paint a very important and emerging picture of your fundraising program, and I think you'll agree. Last year, I went through a similar process to this with one of our clients, Win Without War. They were an organization that just had a massive surge in list growth that they'd experienced through some of their petition advocacy. And they were in a really great place trying to figure out, how do we leverage this great new sort of capacity and data that we have and parlay that into growth in our fundraising program. This was a really excellent thing to be thinking about. And from the outset, looking at them externally, you might have thought, well, like, they've had this great email list growth, maybe their best opportunities are to continue to grow their email program by maybe testing and trying out new strategies, and maybe looking at growing a monthly donor program so that there's some sustainable revenue in place. Sure, those things are both great. But what ultimately ended up happening was that when we looked at the data, what it really told us was that this was an organization in need of a donor retention strategy. Because for all the work they could do acquiring new donors, they really needed to figure out a way to retain donors year over year so that they actually built a sustainable fundraising base. And that was a really essential problem for us to solve. So as soon as we realized that that was the story the numbers were telling us, that was the problem we set out to solve. We worked with them to figure out how to better put in place some strategies around donor stewardship and donor retention, and some really easy, simple things they just hadn't been doing before. But in addition to helping them improve their donor retention rate, one of the other amazing things that happened was that they actually started to quickly, and I think more easily, identify and cultivate new major donor prospects. And in fact, a really significant one happened for them very soon after implementing some of these strategies. So it's certainly icing on the cake, but ultimately this approach gave Win Without War a better foundation to continue growing their fundraising program from, as opposed to just looking at shiny objects and trends that we certainly could have integrated into this process. I work with a breadth of nonprofit organizations to help them figure out their next best moves in their fundraising programs through consulting. If you'd like to learn more about my consulting services, I'll leave a link to them just below this video. Feel free to click that and find out more. And you can also find out how to book a free consultation call with me to talk about what's going on in your fundraising program. Finally, if you've enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more tips and tutorials each week. You can click the button in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen.